So the sexual harassment of women thrives in places where fields are dominated by men, and particularly when the leadership is dominated by men. And contributing factors are when there are few young women who are isolated and who lack role models, female role models and mentors to help guide their training, and also where the system is hierarchical and preferences stars over incoming talent. So academia, like Hollywood, presents a perfect storm for sexual harassment. I'm going to show 4 slides that present the percentage of degrees going to women in different scientific fields from 1990 to 2010, a 20-year period. This plot shows computer sciences and engineering. I don't even need to say the words. The numbers are very low. The change has been slow or non-existent. And in the case of computer science, the peak was some time ago. Things have gone downhill since. The blue line at the bottom is engineering. My own field of physics tracks that line almost exactly. Fewer than 20% of undergraduate majors are women. Interestingly, the same percentage, it's true for several of these fields, the same percentages roughly apply to the PhD degree. So in these fields where the numbers are super low, the big drop is in the undergraduate years, and if you make it through that, then you're as likely as the men to go on to an advanced degree. Contrast that with the life sciences and the social sciences shown here, same 20-year period. The upper colored lines are bachelor's and master's degrees in biosciences and social sciences. They've been at or above 50% for the whole 20-year period. The 2 lower lines, purple and blue, are the PhD degrees. They too are at 50% now, roughly. But you notice that even allowing for the change and some time between a bachelor's degree and a PhD degree, no amount of sliding one graph will make it the other. So in other words, the attrition of women is greater than the attrition of men between bachelor's and PhD degrees. Now the next 2 slides show the same situation for women of color. Here, I want you to notice that the vertical scale has been changed. It goes only up to 20% instead of 100% because the numbers are so low. What you're looking at is bachelor's degrees going to underrepresented women, starting with engineering at the bottom in blue, then with chemistry, computer science, and math being similar in the next 3, and then it goes up to biological sciences, social sciences, and psychology is at the top. But the top is still less than 20%. In other words, it's worse than the situation for women in physics, which is to say mostly white women. If we combine all the sciences and just look at the difference between bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees, here you see the differential attrition between levels very, very clearly. Women are getting sort of 10%, women of color, are getting 10% of the bachelor's degrees, but fewer in the master's and doctorate, and no amount of sliding the one graph to the right will make them match up. So the women of color are not progressing at the same rate as other students. So for some of us, the issue of sexual harassment as a factor in these dismal numbers came into focus with an article published in the summer of 2014 by Kate Clancy, an anthropologist at the University of Illinois, who did a survey of scientists who do their research in the field that is away from home. And what she found, she surveyed about 1,000 people with about a 60-something% return. She found that an appalling number reported having been sexually harassed and or assaulted. Interestingly, men reported primarily being assaulted by peers, while women were overwhelmingly harassed or assaulted by superiors rank. So let me show you some data so this really burns in. So this is the table from their paper, and The vertical columns are sorted by level in the hierarchy. The rows are harassment at the top and assault at the bottom. Harassment meaning an uncomfortable environment, words, pin-up pictures, whatever, and assault being unwelcome touching, anything from the hand on your back, a la Harvey Weinstein, to rape. If you look at the trainee column, that means students and postdocs, which I've highlighted and made a little larger. Between 68% and 86% of trainees report being harassed and assaulted in the field. Women more than men. The numbers in women are higher than the numbers of men. Those numbers are incredible. Even if every person who didn't reply to the survey had never been harassed or assaulted, the percentages would still be appallingly high. This shows the percentage of respondents who said they were harassed by either a local person, an inferior, a peer, or a superior. The blue bars are men, the red bars are women. So you see that men are overwhelmingly harassed by peers and women by superiors. So postdocs by faculty or graduate students by postdocs. The sources of unwanted contact show exactly the same pattern. So the power differential is coming into play far more with women than with men who are being harassed or assaulted. And that's probably because most of the leaders, most of the faculty in these expeditions are men. To give you an update with some recent papers, the Clancy and colleagues followed up their survey with some interviews of the people who had responded to the survey. They found that rules matter. So in field situations where the rules are very clear and harassment and assault are clearly made to be wrong, defined as wrong, there's less of it. And furthermore, that those who had experienced harassment and assault, their careers had suffered. So the connection between the consequence for the younger woman was made clear. And finally, there's no feedback to the harassers. If there are no consequences for their behavior, and that's frequently the case, then the next harasser doesn't see any reason not to do it. And I'll also say that my colleague Christina Ritchie, working with Kate Clancy and her colleagues, did a survey of astronomers and planetary scientists. About almost 500 scientists responded to the survey, so similar to the original Clancy survey, and the results were similar. An appallingly high fraction reported being harassed in the field, which for us is when you're at the telescope. And more importantly, this group looked specifically at the issue of women of color. Women of color suffer from two disadvantages, being women in a male-dominated field and being a minority in a racial and ethnic sense. So they the two effects multiply, and they report much higher incidences of both problems and consequences for themselves, for their careers. So I'm going to skip that one. This is a sign that we post at our registration desk at American Astronomical Society meetings for the last 5 years or so. If it's unwanted, it's harassment. It's person size. You can't miss it. And we have policies, anti-harassment policies at meetings and ethics policies in general, which are also have been done or are being done by other professional societies. And we will make these and other slides available so you don't have to copy them down or anything. So I want to end my brief overview with two things that I tell young people and leaders. So what I tell young people, especially young women, is watch out for sexual harassment. We haven't been warning you that it is as prevalent as the recent stories make us all realize it is. And to the leaders, don't date your trainees.
So yeah, I'm here to talk about challenges in reporting on sexual harassment. I thought I would start with talking about some ways in which I was lucky and sort of helped in this process. Which first, I don't know if Christy Ashwandon is here, but I just remembered recently in the last couple of weeks that actually the very first National Association of Science Writers meeting that I ever attended was in 2013, when there was a double X Factor panel. There were women science journalists on a stage talking very openly about sexual harassment in our own field. And that was sort of my introduction to this profession that I was entering, which I feel very lucky to have experienced. Second of all, I started at BuzzFeed in 2015, and we had just launched a science desk. And the idea was that it was just going to be an extension of the rest of the newsroom to expose institutional injustice, issues like power and money, issues that don't really play a role in sort of the traditional narrative of science journalism, absolutely play a role in science, and we were supposed to report on that stuff. This was in a newsroom that was already very well equipped to deal with stories around sexual assault on college campuses, issues of rape reporting in law enforcement, problems that have been really brought forward in the last 5 or 10 years. We had been really reporting, so we had a lot of support when this story landed on the science desk. So as Meg's intro showed, post the SAFE survey, it was undeniable that there was a problem with sexual harassment in science, but we didn't have the stories to advance. We sort of had this abstract idea of the leaky pipeline, the double bind, all these issues that women in science faced, but we didn't have people coming forward with their particular stories. And so we sort of set out to report on small things as they happened. Tim Hunt, which happened actually at this, I think, in Korea, 10 years or 3 years ago. The science journal cover, which was very problematic. We tried to sort of cover these things until at some point, the part that we can't account for happened, which is that women came forward with a story that they wanted to share, and this was the Jeff Marcy story. 4 individuals had filed a complaint at UC Berkeley, and UC Berkeley had found that he had violated the sexual harassment policies at the school over a period of 9 years. But then they had offered very little in terms of disciplinary action, and the women involved were very upset about that, which is why they came to us. The question was not, is this a problem? The question was, how do we tell these stories so that they're rock solid and fair? Because as everyone knows, the main challenge in women being taken seriously in this space is being believed. So I'd say the 3 biggest challenges in reporting these stories are dealing with institutions, getting documentation, and most importantly, getting buy-in from the women involved. So in terms of dealing with institutions, especially private ones, but even public ones, they have a vested interest in keeping things quiet, dealing with things internally, and as we showed with Marcy, maintaining the status quo. People always raise the issue of money in these situations. Marcy had tens of millions of dollars in grants at UC Berkeley by the time that the investigation came out, and Kate's had, I think, $30 million in active grants at the University of Washington. So whether that plays a role is unclear, but we know that also there are legal issues with tenure that prevent schools from being able to speak out about issues with faculty, with personnel. With Kate's at the University of Washington, this was made very explicit because we actually found out about the case because he had sued his university for placing him on home assignment while they investigated him for sexual harassment. So a tipster had just emailed me saying, search this guy in Pacer, and I found a lawsuit where he had sued the University of Washington for this purpose. And also this obviously plays a role in terms of how the universities deal with these cases. When Marcy resigned, Berkeley confirmed to me that they had never actually fired a tenured professor before. The University of Washington just fired their first professor, Michael Cates, this last August. And then getting documentation is also a huge issue. These university investigations, they happen in Title IX offices, which have different names at each institution, but these are not easy to get. At Berkeley, which is public, the women who filed the complaints were actually able to get their component of the university investigation given to them. At the University of Washington, we were able to FOIA for literally millions of documents. I'm still getting them sent to me on CDs in the mail. But at private schools such as Caltech, they have no requirement to provide this to the students, and certainly not to us. In the Caltech story that we wrote about, the 2 women involved were only allowed to view the investigations if they went into a room without any recording devices, and then they could see the product of the complaints that they had filed. So it also really helps us if we can get correspondence, even corroboration from things like texts and emails from the time that showed that, these women, when they experienced an uncomfortable experience and told their friends about it, that it actually happened the time that they said that it did. And most importantly, we need buy-in from the women involved. So going public with a story like this is obviously a huge life choice. We all know that in science, reputation, relationships really determine your career. And it's a huge emotional burden for these women to carry. So one thing that I always try to do when I talk to these women initially is offer to talk off the record at first, just informally, so that they can understand what the process of going public with a story is like, and I can sort of walk them through all the steps that we'll have to go through before we finally hit publish. And then also making very clear from the outset that I'm a reporter, I'm not an advocate, I'm not an activist, and I will have to tell the story in all the shades of gray and with all the messiness that I see it. There can be often, it's a very intimate relationship when these women are talking to me about these experiences that have been very difficult for them, and it's very important to establish that up front, that I am still a reporter and I'm still reporting a story. And then the last thing is issues of allies bringing stories forward. I often get emails in my inbox of really well-meaning people who are like, there's a really bad harasser in our department, here are the names of the women that have been harassed, and here's their contact information, and you should reach out to them. And that's very well-meaning, but the women themselves often in those situations don't actually want a story to be made public, and not everybody does. So we can't really follow up with every story that we find out about. It's really up to the people who are involved. So all this stuff, all these challenges, all this makes it so that our stories can hopefully be legally protected, but also so that when our stories finally publish, these accounts are believed, that they're not dismissed as he said, she said, but understood to be the lived experience of some people, even if you haven't seen that same thing with your own eyes. Obviously, that has been made clear with Harvey Weinstein and the Me Too campaign and everything. So yeah, I think that's it. I have ideas about, things I think about going forward, reporting in the space, but we can talk about it later.
So, hello, I'm Frances Hellman. I'm from the University of California, Berkeley. So, I was asked to talk about challenges and potential solutions for improving the environment for women in science and combating sexual harassment in the future. And so I'm going to start with that first topic, which is obviously a huge topic, so I'm really going to limit myself to just making 2 short points. The first one is that numbers matter. You've seen the numbers in the slides that we saw before. We need to find ways to sustain women, their interest and their engagement in the sciences from the time that they are girls into the undergraduate, graduate, professional, particularly the postdoctoral years, and on into their careers. Perhaps even more than we need to attract women, we need to find ways to ensure that the girls and women who show promise and want to stay in are encouraged and supported to do it. It's actually rather shocking how many women enter college intending to be in sciences and then the attrition rate all the way through is extraordinarily high. So it's important that girls and women see that other women find educational and professional paths in science. They see that they find them rewarding and exciting. Personally, of course, I am a woman scientist. I find it incredibly exciting, and I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't. So to the extent that there are role models, this will help. With more women, a more subtle point is, in addition to the sort of traditional role model, simply the fact that if there are more women, they will be seen in terms of their individual accomplishments instead of in terms of their gender, and I think that is a goal we have to aspire to, where their accomplishments are actually more important than their gender. That leaves you free to work on your research goals or your educational goals without psychological loads associated with problems like stereotype threat, which most of us are in the educational world are very aware of. Turning to UC Berkeley in particular, we are, one of the most important things we do is providing mentoring, and that is mentoring at all levels, junior faculty, graduate students, undergraduates, outreach to middle school and high school. It's important that people who are respected within the scientific community encourage girls and women to follow their interests. We have, in particular, one of the organizations I'm particularly proud of, and I've been long associated with, is the Society for Women in the Physical Sciences. And interestingly, that is led not by faculty, who really are in supporting roles, but is led by the graduate students and then in turn the undergraduate women. So that's the first point. We just really need the numbers to grow. Second point, we have to find a way to be sure we evaluate and advance women fairly in relation to their merits. There is just a shockingly large number of studies that show that men and women are viewed differently when it comes to assessing their abilities and achievements in many different professional contexts. So that's not just in science, but more generally. But this includes their own self-assessments. And that's a particularly horrifying example of a problem with perceptions, when your own self-perception is getting in the way of truly assessing your own abilities. So none of us are separate from society. And if our society is making assumption about girls' abilities or life paths, it affects everyone, including the girls and women themselves and those around them. We have to be aware of this. We have to be asking ourselves if our processes are truly fair, if we're inadvertently overlooking highly qualified women. There are really shocking examples out there of things that are brought to bear in assessing women. I read an article just this morning about 2 career cases where women are routinely, in assessing whether a woman should be taken on as a faculty member, the topic of whether or not she is married and what they're going to do about the spouse comes up. And maybe that might seem an obvious thing to worry about. Somebody is not going to take this job if there is a partner who can't join them. But the same should be true in reverse. The same should be true for men, and it doesn't come up for men. So these biases, these underlying premises that we all carry, and by the way, it's true of women assessing women as much as it is true of men assessing women. We're all part of our society, and we all bring these biases to bear. So at Berkeley, we try to address this by utilizing explicit strategies in admissions and in hiring to try and look at a holistic, comprehensive review, to try and be explicit about criteria. But it's a difficult problem, and one that we're far from really knowing how to address. So turning to sexual harassment, my biggest message, well, I have several comments I want to make around this. One is that I think we all know that sexual harassment has always been here, but increased attention has led to a lot more awareness of the issue and has led to very important modifications in how to support the survivors, how to investigate reports, and how to deal with disciplinary actions. And each one of those, I'm not going to, in the however many minutes I have left, go into the details of what we've done at Berkeley. We've chosen to really take actions in all of those areas. I'm just going to make a couple of comments. One of the most, I would almost call it a campaign motto, is it's on me, it's on us. So it's not somebody else's problem to deal with. It's on me to figure out how to make the climate better for women in science. It's on me to deal with my colleague who is being a jerk. It's on us. It's not somebody else's problem. It's on each of us to take on what roles we can do. So from a policies perspective, there's been a lot of focus in terms of prevention and education, as well as a lot on survivor support. Campus and the UC system overall has taken quite a large number of steps, including expanding and improving both prevention and education efforts. There was clearly room to improve in all of that. New and strengthened models for adjudicating cases involving faculty and administrators. Increased funding to provide the campus with more Title IX investigators, and more confidential advocates. We have something called Path to Care and counseling and so forth. The next point I would make, harassment is it's oppressive, and I mean that in a rather deep way. So in addition to depriving individuals of opportunity, it deprives the community of the talents of individuals who are silenced or demoralized by it. And our academic mission, including the progress of science, suffers as a result of that. So addressing sexual harassment in science is particularly important because of the way science organizes its educational research processes. We are inherently a collaborative. This is a collaborative work. The image of scientists sitting alone in their offices is not really how science works. So it's important that we bring new scientists into our community, and that's generally via apprenticeship, via collaboration, via mentoring, and I'm going to be speak a little bit from my own perspective. What really should be a sacred bond of mentoring and collaboration is violated by sexual harassment. And when I say, speaking from my own perspective, I mean, I view my role as a collaborator and as a mentor to the graduate students and postdocs and undergraduates who work with me, that is a sacred bond. And if that is violated, it does damage that is very hard to fix. I mean, no matter what punishment you give to the perpetrator, you can't actually fix the damage. So at the dean's level, I came into the Marcy situation, and I'm, by the way, not going to talk about the details of it, but I came into it sort of midway through. One of the steps that I took was creation of a task force, and that task force was at my level, meaning my departments, the 5 departments that are in my division, and I had faculty, staff, graduate students, postdocs, et cetera, and we met and talked about all of the issues around that. It dovetailed with task forces that were put together at the campus level and at the university, the system-wide level. We were particularly blessed that one of the members of my task force was on the campus-wide task force. So we both took on as a mission discussing, awareness of what constitutes sexual harassment, what activities are allowed and what are not allowed. Even that is an important discussion. Departments held meetings. Each department, well, this has actually been a long-standing thing, but we formalized it, an equity advisor. There was a lot of discussions around the topic of confidential reporting. Many of the students want a method of confidential reporting and fundamentally did not trust the investigative methods. The office, the Title IX office, who is supposed to be the guardians of this system, they didn't trust them. And so what do you do when you don't trust the people who are supposed to be protecting you? And so we had a lot of discussions around that, about confidential drop boxes, about confidential advisors. We are considered we, meaning the faculty and even the graduate students, are considered responsible employees. So we are legally required, if somebody comes to us, to report the situation, to report it to the Office of the OPHT. So that was a problem, and so how was that dealt with? So there was a lot of discussion about field work. We've heard that mentioned, that there are huge issues that are specific to science with things out in the field. There are also large issues with visiting scientists where they're not part of the formal university system, and so they don't get training, for example. They're not there that long, nonetheless. And a lot of discussion about investigative processes. Now, in many cases, our conversations ended up getting kicked up to the campus level, and this resulted in actions such as there really are major new systems in place at Berkeley campus in the last few years. There's a lot still to do at my departmental level, and we're still working on how to improve climate, particularly what to do, how to ensure that people are aware of the issues. At the risk of suggesting that I know much about what journalists can do, I would offer just a few suggestions or a few comments. I think journalists and scientists, we actually share quite a bit. We have things in common. Like you, we prize facts. We work hard to identify kernels of truth and things that matter in the context of a ton of information. We want to advance knowledge. We want to ensure public understanding. Our work, like yours, sometimes moves very quickly, and we want to publish rapidly what we find. And so that's a challenge, how to balance these, how to get it right and how to get it right quickly is an issue for people in science as well as journalists. So the only thing I can say is, it's important, as you know, that you report on the full arc of a situation. Sometimes it seems partial reporting of interim events is awkward. Be aware of the issue of re-traumatizing survivors when you're interviewing them, that many times they don't actually want to talk. Bear in mind that there's issues of confidentiality in the processes, and they're there to protect, people think that they're there to protect the respondent, the person who's been accused, but they're there to protect both sides. Many times campus leaders cannot speak publicly about a case or even that a case exists until it's been adjudicated, and sometimes that takes time. So I'm going to close with my summary points. One is, I think, and I believe I'm speaking not just for UC Berkeley here, I really do believe that scientists and academics are genuinely concerned about curbing harassment and creating an environment that is conducive to the success of women in science. And I really do believe that. I believe that this is the vast majority of academics care about this. It's on me, it's on us, and people are owning that. At Berkeley, and I believe this is true nationally, we have strengthened campus support and counseling functions. The message to the survivors being, you are not alone, support is available. We have improved our investigatory and our disciplinary procedures to help ensure accountability at every level. And while sexual harassment issues are, of course, of concern to all of us, it is particularly important with respect to students, postdocs, and junior faculty. And there are emotional aspects and concerns about their career which may make individuals reluctant to report and work at the community level, which in my case means really the department level or the student advising level, to create a supportive environment where information is shared and the community looks out for each other is really perhaps the most important message of all.
Hi, can you all hear me? Great. I'm Ritu Chatterjee, and I'm at NPR right now, but I've spent the last several years living in New Delhi, India, which is also my home country. And in 2016, I got to do a couple quick hit stories on a sexual harassment case that was all over the headlines, all over the news media in India about former IPCC chief, the head of the former Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Rajendra Pachauri, who also headed for at least a couple of decades a very prestigious think tank in New Delhi called the Tata Energy and Resources Institute. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the case and how I got to cover it, but I want to start with a personal anecdote, which will sort of give you, I hope, a sort of understanding of the social cultural setting in which the case and cases took place. Francis mentioned that this is, this isn't just an issue in science. It's a larger societal problem, and I want to talk a little bit about how understanding the larger culture and larger sort of legal framework in any place that you decide to cover it is very important. So in 2008, I was living in DC and working as an environmental journalist, and I planned my first reporting trip to India. And when I was in New Delhi, I was going to be attending a conference at this institute, which goes by the acronym TERI. And it was a sustainable development conference, and I was going there to just cover it for the publication that I was working at the time. And when I was there, a friend of mine, a local Indian environmental journalist, asked me if I planned to meet and interview Rajendra Pachauri, who was at the time the IPCC chief and headed this institute. And a year before that, he had, along with Al Gore, accepted the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on climate change. And I said, well, I'm going to the institute. I don't have any plans to interview him, but maybe I will. Why do you ask? And he says, well, if you do end up talking to him, be careful. I said, why is that? And he said, well, he has a reputation of being inappropriate with young women. And I have a friend who he's harassed over the years, who worked with him, and she's been left devastated and traumatized, so just be careful. So, the Weinstein case and the #MeToo campaign has kind of brought attention to the fact that, most women have at some point in their lives experienced sexual harassment, and most of us live with the knowledge that we're likely to bump into people who will harass it at some point of time. And I forget who used the word whisper network, so this was sort of like the local whisper network warning me, a journalist, about something that was supposedly somewhat known within certain circles in Delhi, among at least certain people. But anyway, I didn't make much of it. I went, did my work, didn't get to meet with Dr. Pachauri in person. And over the years, I would hear these rumors again and again, but nobody had come forward. Azine mentioned the fact that most victims don't want their experiences to go public, but also to give you a sense of the legal framework at the time in India. There were no laws protecting victims of sexual harassment. Even though girls and women are, aware of or have experienced sexual harassment at some point of time, it wasn't something that was openly talked about, and not just sexual harassment. Gender violence in general was not talked about except amongst friends and allies. And again, in these sort of whisper networks. But fast forward from 2008 to 2012, there was a horrific gang rape case, which most of you maybe have read about or heard about. It made the headlines all over the world. It's come to be known as the Delhi gang rape case. And a young woman was brutally gang raped on a bus. She died. But it was sort of a big turning point for India because it was followed by massive protests. Never in my life have I seen so many men and women, ordinary citizens, come out onto the streets of India and say no to gender violence. What that also did was it made India pass stricter laws against gender violence, and for the first time pass an act that required employers with more than 10 employees to act on any and all complaints of sexual violence, sexual harassment in their workplace. So should a victim come forward and complain, employers were now required by law to act on it. So that, for the first time, emboldened and empowered women in India to come forward with their complaints. For the first time, perhaps, in India's history, the taboo against talking about gender violence of all sorts, including sexual harassment in the workplace, the taboo was broken and more women started coming forward. And in 2015, February of 2015, a 29-year-old researcher at this institute went to the director of the institute, gave a written complaint that Dr. Pachauri, who was then still the head of IPCC and the institute, had for a year and a half sexually harassed her, pushing her to have a physical relationship with him, and despite the fact that she'd repeatedly refused to, and she turned over emails and text messages, Pachauri denied the allegation, said that his computer had been hacked. These messages were planted in his devices, and he stepped down from the IPCC and the institute. So by now you have the law that requires employers to act. So this institute, TERI, goes ahead and starts an investigation. Months down the line, the investigation finds him guilty. And what happens? Nothing. He stays on indefinite leave, and a year later, the institute announces that it's creating a newer, higher position for him. So he's invited back to the institute, despite the fact that the investigation found him guilty of sexually harassing this woman, but the institute decides to promote him. And in the meantime, what he's also done, he's appealed to courts in India to issue a gag order for the media while the case is under investigation. So you see, I talked about one step forward in protecting victims in the new law that was passed in 2013, but there were previous, more archaic laws that set things back. And the gag order was passed and media coverage died down. But thankfully, in this case, unlike other cases where the alleged perpetrators were powerful men, the courts overturned the gag order and media coverage continued. But nothing, he stayed on leave, but a year later he was promoted and brought back to TERI, which at this time, there was already growing outrage against these cases. And so women's rights activists spoke out. The media jumped on the case, and at this point, that's when I came and did a story for Science Magazine and PRI's and BBC's, the World Radio Program. But there too, Azine was talking about the resources and time needed to do these stories. And I, of course, as a freelancer at the time, did not have that, but I was thankful that editors were willing to take even a news coverage on this story. But it was impossible for me to get somebody to talk to me from the Institute. And as I was sitting in New Delhi reading Azine's and other stories about sexual harassment in science that were coming out, and many scientists were for the first time publicly admitting, acknowledging that yes, there was a problem and we have to do something about it. But in India, even though societally it had been kind of a turning point in people supposedly saying no to gender violence of all sorts, no scientist came out and publicly spoke up against this. Nobody said, yes, this is a problem, we have to acknowledge this. So the laws had moved forward, but culturally, society was more readily saying no to sexual harassment and sexual violence when it was a poor man, maybe a migrant worker, but when it came to powerful men, whether it was a scientist, whether it was a journalist, there was a very high-profile case of a journalist in a very progressive magazine as well. People were still uncomfortable speaking out. But thankfully for me, I was able to talk to some students who were supposed to receive their master's degrees from Pachauri, and they came out and publicly boycotted the graduation ceremony and said, why hasn't the Institute done something? Why are they promoting him? We will not accept our diplomas from somebody who's an alleged perpetrator. Anyway, so socially, culturally, these stories can be really, really hard to do. But since then, what's happened is the cases have dragged on in the court. And he has also filed a civil defamation suit against the lawyer of the victim in this case. And so it's essentially had the effect that it's dragging on in the courts, and he's pretty much untouched in terms of his career. The victim and two other victims have come out since publicly, and yet the case is still dragging on, and there hasn't been any justice for the victims. So in terms of challenges, the legal challenges are huge, the cultural challenges are huge. In terms of solutions, I don't know what the solutions are, except that, I think whatever it is, even though the case is dragging on, the victims don't have justice yet, I would say that it's still, social, cultural change takes time, and at least we're at a better place than we were, say, in 2008 when I first heard about these cases, these stories. Looking forward to more thoughts and discussions on this.
Yes, it's on. Just a few reflections. Now the panel looks really far away, but can you talk a little bit over the last 2 years? So Azine's article about Jeff Marcy was 2 years ago this month. How much has the glare of publicity really moved the subject along toward more change, and how much has the rest of society, with so many other cases and now the pressure of sorts from the Weinstein case, making it more of an issue? So do you think things have changed and that the publicity has had a real impact in that change?
Oh, okay, the academic perspective. Yeah, I think it's made a change. For every one person who's been outed in the media, by the way, there's at least one who's been silently removed from their institution. So institutions are, that's at least in the field I know, one for one. So institutions are more aware of this, but you know, if you think that the Marcy and the paleontologist from AMNH and the, you know, the guy in Washington, if you think those are the only ones, I mean, you must be kidding yourself. There must be 10 times as many out there. So we haven't really gotten that far.
Well, I was really thinking about getting some more systemic coverage of the problem, and also more coverage of what some of the scientific societies are doing in terms of equating sexual harassment with scientific misconduct and ethics. And in other words, do you feel like there's actually been a change in the scientific community publicity?
So I would say it's starting. I was looking up the policies. Not as many professional societies have made progress as I would like, but I believe rules matter. And for example, at our university, no professor is allowed to have a relationship with any undergraduate student. And no professor is allowed to have a relationship with a graduate student in the same or related department. And if they do have a relationship with someone in a completely different department, it has to be transparent. Those are very simple rules. If you violate them, you know, very simple action. The problem is most of our institutions do not have those rules. People still confuse the personal and the professional. And this power differential cannot be minimized. When you are a teacher, you have a sacred bond, I think Francis used that term, with your student. And young men who are students of our great male scientists don't ever think about, is this conversation happening because that guy is trying to mentor me and he's interested in my work and my future? Or does he just want to hit on me? That's what the young women have to think about. So I think simple rules and policies really matter. Having anti-harassment policies at your meetings matters, so that you can tell someone not to come to your meeting if they violate it, and so on. And I feel like we have not made much progress in that direction. Yeah.
Something I always would get asked about was whether astronomy in particular had a problem. And I think what I've heard from a lot of astronomers, particularly junior ones, is that it's not that our problem is necessarily worse, but it's that there is a very active community of junior scientists in particular who are focusing on shedding light on the problem and also trying to fix it. And that's why these cases, and senior scientists, yes. But I saw this in the Caltech case that we wrote about, Christian Ott. He was supposed to return to campus this September, and students staged protests when he was coming back on campus. And really undergraduates in both the astronomy and the physics department really banded together to take control of this and get the administration to understand that they didn't want this to happen. And you know, they ended up handing down the decision that they didn't recommend that he come back, and he did resign. I think that sort of activism on a student level is something that is also very much why we're hearing about this now, is that there is a lot of energy on college campuses. You know, female students are feeling more empowered and are shedding light on a problem that has been there for a very long time.
Well, I guess from my perspective, I'll hold this further away. I guess from my perspective, I see that quite a bit has changed. And I would point, okay, a little closer. There's quite the echo up here. So from my perspective, actually quite a bit has changed. And I would point to an enormous increase in the confidential advocates, which is something that is badly needed. It's part of the issue. You know, the primary thing is prevention. I mean, I think we would all agree that, you know, the old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think that's the right way around. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So anything we can do in prevention is far more effective than anything we do in afterwards punishing people. The goal is to make it not happen. You can't fix it. Punishment is not fixing it. And I see huge progress in the type of training that we now undergo, the attention to training, that it's a lot more thoughtful. The attention to the confidential advocates program, the increase in the number of investigators, so that one of the issues that was routinely pointed to is when there was a report, it would take far too long to be adjudicated, and some of that was just the practical consequence of not having enough people doing the investigating, that they were understaffed. So I see that there's been enormous changes in the training, in the counseling, in the support for the survivors, and in the community awareness. One of the things is the bystander training, and so there's starting to be a lot of attention to what do you know, that it isn't okay to just stand by. Even if you're not the perpetrator, it's not okay to know that one of your colleagues, or to watch one of your colleagues behave inappropriately. And so I think it actually has, frankly, from my perspective, changed a lot. It's become much more openly discussed and much more openly dealt with and hopefully prevented.
I might have come across sounding very negative in terms of progress, but I have to say that even back home in India, I definitely, watching the cases unfold here from afar, I feel like things have changed a lot. But even in India and globally, I do see that the conversation makes a big difference. And I've covered, for years I covered global health and development, and so written and reported a fair bit on gender issues in general, and often empowerment takes a generation. And so what I'm seeing that the conversation has started openly in a way that didn't used to happen before, which is a big first step. And second, I see the young generation of scientists, whether it's back home or here, be much more vocal about it. Whether scientists, even students, like in the case for Pachauri, it was the young master students who came out and said, sorry, I'm not taking my degree from an alleged perpetrator, and I'm not sitting back and staying shut, keeping my mouth shut when the institute is rewarding an alleged perpetrator instead of investigating him and punishing him. So while it feels slow and not enough, I feel that that's a huge change from the time 20 years ago when I was training to be a scientist before I turned to science journalism, and that's a big change.
Okay, we're running short on time. I would love to have one or two questions if anyone is by this one mic and has a burning question. I'd also say that on the website, we are going to be posting both a full deck of the slides that Meg has, as well as resource list of articles suggested by all of the participants on the panel, and that should be up by tomorrow. I might give a tiny self-call, as I've been working on an article on sexual harassment in science for a long time. It's been in the works for weeks, and it went up this afternoon. So a number of the people on this panel are interviewed. It's pretty much an overview. So that's at scientificamerican.com. So some of these studies and issues that is dealt with in the post-Weinstein era, which isn't that long, but it's also changed things. So those resources will be up. Okay, just a couple.
Hi there. My name's Lisa Harvey-Smith. I'm an astronomer. I was a little bit troubled by the concept that prevention was somehow more important than, I guess, doing something against the perpetrator. What we've seen again and again in these cases is that nothing really bad happens to the perpetrator. They're even given a free holiday for a year, fully paid, or they're sent, given the opportunity to resign. There's, Jeff Marcy was actually resigned and was given an emeritus professorship when he left. So I've never ever seen something really bad happen to a perpetrator of sexual harassment. And I think to the victims, the survivors, that speaks volumes. And I think still the organizations are not accepting that and not really seeing that. I guess a comment, and I'd be interested to hear comments on that.
Okay, just some brief reactions.
I'll just give one. There was somebody fired just this past year from Berkeley. Well, there's one I know of. They don't tend to be publicized. Perhaps they should be. I mean, I think you're raising an important point in that I don't know that we have yet figured out how to balance issues around, I don't know what to call them other than privacy, and I understand how frustrating that is to the victims, but we haven't quite figured out, once a case is resolved, then it becomes public. But anyway, there was somebody that I know of that was fired in this past year for sexual harassment, and I don't know what fraction that is.
But when Marcy was made emeritus, I did call the press office at Berkeley, and they confirmed that they had never fired a tenured professor in their history. At the University of Washington, Michael Cates was just fired this past August, but it was the first time that they had done so. So it is a problem, and I think probably the extension of that is, what happens after they leave these places. Does this record follow them? And from everything we've seen, the answer is no. And again, it comes down to privacy, personnel issues, et cetera, but it is a very real problem. Amy Harmon's story about Jason Lieb getting fired from the University of Chicago, having a record that dated back to UNC and Princeton, these are things that could be called out in advance, and they're not because of sort of the systems that we have in place, but the systems that we have in place are protecting. I think it is important to acknowledge that.
Just make it really short, because I want to hear the other questions. But one thing, there is legislation proposed by a Democrat, so it may not get far, but legislation proposed that would require universities to report sexual misconduct in the same way that they currently have to report other kinds of research misconduct. That would make a big difference to people being able to move, because if you can't get grants, you can't have a career.
I have to add one more comment, which is we are a public institution. We report everything. There is actually a website that shows everything on it, all cases to the extent they're not confidential, but there is already a reporting requirement on us. We are audited regularly by the state. We are audited regularly by the feds. So I'm not, and by the way, I appreciate your comment that prevention is not in lieu of punishment. It's not. If that came across that way, I did not mean it that way. It's more in the category of an ounce of prevention. If we can prevent future things, but does not excuse not taking account of punishment where it's appropriate.
Well, in fact, back to that point of the legislation that Meg mentioned, certainly a number of the societies are starting to move in the direction of defining sexual harassment or harassment in general as scientific misconduct. And part of it is there's not going to be a lot happening in the US Congress, but the fact that there are efforts to both equate it with serious misconduct. What hasn't happened is removing funding, and there's legislation for that as well. Just a quick question rather than a comment, if we can just get a little bit in, and we'll just have one person answer each question. Okay.
This is a good one. So, Azine, you mentioned that you sometimes get tips from well-meaning allies about stories, and you can't always report on everything. How does a reporter balance the wishes of victims of harassment and assault, the respect for those people, the desire to avoid re-traumatizing those people, with the principles of journalism and the need to tell true stories about what's happening in our world?
Well, I think these stories are unusual in that they do absolutely require the buy-in of the people involved. We have received a lot of tips about people who have been accused of assault or harassment that we have not reported on because the people involved frankly don't need this in their lives. And it's one thing to have allies reach out to us who are already acting as chaperones in concert with victims. It's another thing for someone, in the department to sort of out that to us. That's maybe something they should raise with their department head or with, someone in the administration at the school, like the bystander stuff that Francis was talking about. But, it's incredibly important, especially because of how in depth we have to go, how much we do have to repeat stuff with them, get them to, go through emails and text messages from the time. It's like a very, very big investment emotionally, and the people have to be, the victims involved have to have full buy-in. And that comes at the cost of reporting every story that we find out about that might, truthfully have merit.
These stories also take a lot of time for the reporters. So how much time has it taken for your investigative pieces?
I would say they usually take like 1 to 3 months. It sort of depends, how much. From the University of Washington, we had to FOIA for documents. We also got sued by Michael Cates, which extended the timeline a little bit. So, but in the case of Berkeley, they were very, very prepared. They had all their documents. We knew, we were able to then also contact people who had tried to report him, in 2004, predating any official complaints, and that was part of the story as well, but we were able to do that more quickly.
This is the last question because there's going to be a plenary rushing in here, and we are all threatened with our lives if we don't stop on time.
All right.
Okay.
I'm a French reporter. In France, we had cases with politicians. You remember Dominique Strauss-Kahn, of course, but others. We had cases in cinema, but with scientists and in academics, there was 20 years ago a case, but it didn't go through. And besides of that, we have no other cases. We are, of course, convinced that it takes place in our universities and research centers too. What would be your advice to try to work on the subject and to have stories, if I can say, but to be able to work on this issue?
Maybe, Ritu, since you've dealt with the much less coverage in the rest of the world, obviously, so could you give some advice on that, and that'll be our last point.
It's a tough one. Unless, again, I think Azine should also speak to this, because in my case, like I said, I'd heard of the stories, but I couldn't report on them until there was a legal change that made it easier for victims to come forward and report the cases too. The legal change also led to kind of a cultural change. So I can't say that I have any particular good advice.
I have spoken to some people internationally before, and it's been very difficult because I don't fully understand the cultural, tolerance for different behaviors, and it is different. And they can sort of view things that we view as extremely inappropriate here in the U.S. as sort of fine, I think it takes having that baseline intolerance, to find that. I don't know if, I don't have a great answer for that either. I think at the level of universities, I don't know, if there must be some movement within the universities themselves of women faculty who do identify the problem. It is, I think, very hard for us as journalists to find that absent of sort of that level of activism from within. That's at least what I've found. And maybe that's...
The other thing that I will
Maybe
add...
I'm wrong, but I don't see I don't think we can do an appeal on the internet and say, if you're in such situation, just
I think you can.
write to us.
I think you can.
I don't know. I would feel...
Okay.
It is, I think it's...
I'm so sorry. This is a whole discussion
Our speakers will be exiting, and you can grab them for a moment. And we would like to continue the discussion. There should be a link to the World Conference of Science Journalists to this panel, and there will be a place to get resources, more information, and I hope to kind of keep growing that. So thank you very much.
And thank our